The fire had been burning for hours before Orville Ware said a single word. Della stood near the doorway of the main room, close enough to hear him breathe, far enough to feel the draft coming under the door behind her. October had arrived the way it always did in Claiborne County, without ceremony, without warning, like a neighbor who never knocked. The cold came down from the ridgeline in the afternoon, and by evening it had settled into the floorboards, into the walls, into the spaces between people who had stopped finding comfort in each other long before the season gave them reason. She had known something was coming for weeks, not because her father had said anything. Orville Ware was not a man who announced his intentions. He was a man who made decisions the way stone makes decisions, slowly, completely, without apology. You didn't see it happening. You only felt it when it was already done, when the weight of the finished thing had settled into the ground around you, and you understood that the ground was different now, and was not going to change back. He was sitting in the chair nearest the fire, the one with the cracked leather arm that he had never repaired and never replaced. His hands rested on his knees, his eyes were on the flames. He had the look of a man who had already finished a conversation in his head and was now waiting for the other person to catch up to the conclusion he had reached without them. On the small table beside him there was a folded piece of paper. Della had seen it there when she came in from the yard. She had not asked about it. She had learned early that asking Orville Ware about something before he was ready to speak about it was like pushing on a door that opened the other way. You only hurt your hand. The door went nowhere you wanted to go. So she had come inside and taken off her coat and hung it on the peg near the door and waited, because waiting was the one language her father understood without difficulty. The fire popped. A log shifted. Somewhere in the back of the house she could hear the faint sound of movement. Nessa, her younger sister, 19 years old, quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are listening through walls and don't want the listening to be audible. Orville reached over without looking and picked up the folded paper. He held it out toward Della with one hand, his eyes still on the fire, as though the gesture were something his arm was doing independently of the rest of him. She crossed the room and took it. She unfolded it carefully. The paper was thin, the kind used for official documents, and it had been handled before the creases were soft, worn at the edges, as though someone had opened and closed it many times over a period of months. The handwriting was formal, the language the kind that county offices used when they wanted to sound permanent and beyond dispute. It was a deed, a land deed. The property was described in the dry language of surveyors, boundaries measured in chains and rods, referenced against creek lines and ridge points that only a man with a transit and a long morning would be able to locate precisely. But the name of the place was there, written plainly in the middle of the page, the way you might write the name of something that everyone already knew and nobody needed to have explained. Calder Falls. Della read it twice. Then she stood very still. Everyone in Claiborne County knew that name. It was the kind of name that appeared in conversations the way storm clouds appeared over the eastern ridge. You noticed it, you watched it, and you did not walk toward it. 3 men had died near Calder Falls in the past 20 years. 1 in the water, 2 on the rocks above during seasons when the mist froze on the stone and turned the approach into something that offered no second chances. The locals had a name for the place that they used among themselves, the kind of name that communities give to locations where something has gone wrong enough times to become a pattern that everyone accepts as permanent. They called it the Widowmaker. The land around the falls was described in the few conversations Della had ever heard about it as worthless. Rock and mist and steep ground that couldn't be farmed and couldn't be mined and couldn't be built on in any way that made practical sense. It sat at the far edge of a property that had belonged to her father's sister, Cora Ware, who had died the previous winter of a fever that moved faster than anyone expected and left behind fewer things than most people accumulate in a lifetime. Cora had never married. She had lived alone in a small house at the edge of the county for most of her adult life, keeping to herself in the way that some people do when the world has not been particularly kind to them, and they have decided with the pragmatism of someone who has run the numbers to reduce their exposure. She and Della had spoken perhaps a dozen times in Della's memory. She remembered a thin woman with careful eyes and hands that were always doing something, mending, carving, measuring as though stillness were a condition she had examined and found wanting. Della looked up from the paper. Her father was still watching the fire. She waited for him to speak, to explain, to give her the shape of what this meant, because she understood what she was holding technically, but she did not yet understand the why of it. And the why was the part that mattered. He said, "That's all there is." 4 words. Flat and final as a door closing on a room you would not be entering again. She understood then. Not all of it, not the full depth of it, not the parts that would only become clear much later and from unexpected directions, but the essential thing. She was holding everything she was going to receive from Orville Ware, and she was holding it in one hand, and it weighed almost nothing. She folded the paper along its existing creases and held it at her side. She did not cry. She had cried in front of her father exactly once in her life when she was 7 years old, and had fallen from the fence post at the edge of the south pasture and broken 2 fingers on her left hand. He had looked at her tears the way he looked at weather, as a condition to be waited out, rather than a thing to be responded to. She had learned the lesson quickly, and applied it thoroughly in the years that followed. She turned toward the door. She paused at the hallway just for a moment. The door to the back room was open a few inches. In the gap she could see Nessa standing very still, her right hand pressed flat against the cold glass of the window, her face pale in the October dark outside, and in the lamplight inside both at once. Their eyes met. Nessa's lips pressed together, not quite a smile, not quite anything expressible as a single emotion. Just acknowledgement. Just, "I see you. I know. I was already listening." Della walked out the front door. The cold hit her like an open hand across the face. She stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the night sounds of the valley. The creek at the bottom of the hill moving over its stones, the wind in the high branches of the hickory trees, the distant call of something she couldn't identify in the darkness. The sky was clear and full of stars, the kind of sky that Appalachian autumn produced, with the casual extravagance of a place that had not yet been dimmed by anything man-made or man-decided. She had $19.42 in the small leather pouch she kept in her coat pocket. She had the clothes she was wearing and the boots on her feet, good boots bought second-hand at the Aldgate market 2 years ago, re-soled once since then, still solid through the soles and the uppers. She had the land deed for a property that everyone in the county considered a dead end in the most literal sense of the phrase. She was 21 years old. She stood on the porch until the cold became something that required a decision rather than a tolerance. And then she walked down the steps and turned toward the road. She did not look back at the house. She had learned that too, that looking back at things that were finished was a way of giving them more weight than they deserved, more gravity than they had earned, and she had no weight to spare. She walked toward Aldgate. She walked through most of the night. The town of Aldgate sat at the junction of 2 creeks in a narrow valley between 2 granite ridges that had been standing in approximately their current position since before anything in the valley below them had a name. It was small enough that everyone knew everyone and everyone knew everything, and the main commercial street was 3 blocks long with the general store at one end and the feed barn at the other, and not much of consequence in between. On a Tuesday morning in mid-October, the town was quiet in the specific way of places that work hard and rest early, and have made their peace with both of those things. Gideon Pratt's general store occupied a long, low building near the center of the main street. The sign above the door was old enough that the paint had faded past legibility. You had to know what it said to read it, which meant the people who needed to find it already knew where it was, and that arrangement had worked for 25 years without causing problems. Inside the store had the particular smell of places that have been selling the same categories of things for decades: flour, leather, iron, salt, lamp oil, the ghost of tobacco from years of the same customers buying the same tobacco and standing in the same spots on the plank floor while they talked about weather and prices and the things that were always happening to someone else. Gideon Pratt himself was 65 years old and built like a man who had spent the first half of his life doing heavy work and the second half thinking carefully about what he had learned from it. He had been a coal miner in his younger years in the operations further north in the county, where the seams ran shallow and close to the surface and the work was relentless and poorly paid. Before that, a blacksmith's assistant. And before that, whatever work a young man could find in a place where work was always present but money was always scarce, and the distance between the two was a fact of life rather than an injustice. He had bought the general store at 40 after a mine collapse had taken 3 men who had been working 30 feet from where he was standing and had made him reconsider with considerable urgency the wisdom of spending his days underground. He had run the store since then with the methodical efficiency of someone who understood that a business like a mine required constant attention to the things that could go wrong, because the things that could go wrong were always more numerous than the things that were currently going right. He was behind the counter when Della came in, working through a ledger with the focused expression of a man who did not enjoy ledgers but respected their necessity and was not going to pretend otherwise. He looked up when the bell above the door sounded, and he took her in the coat, the boots, the single night's worth of travel written on her face, the folded paper in her hand, and his expression shifted in the way that people's expressions shift when they recognize a type of situation they have encountered before and know the general shape of without needing the specific details explained. He said nothing immediately. He set down his pencil and waited. This was one of the things Della would come to appreciate about Gideon Pratt. Over the course of the following year, his understanding that some situations required the other person to begin. She put the deed on the counter. He picked it up, read it, adjusted his reading spectacles, read it again. She watched his face the way you watch a river, when you are trying to read the current, looking for the information that the surface is carrying up from somewhere deeper and more reliable. His eyebrows moved once slightly on the second read. His mouth tightened at one corner in the way of a man who has seen something he recognizes and is deciding what to do with the recognition. He set the paper down. Then he said something she had not expected. "I tried to buy this land 6 years ago." Della looked at him. "From your Aunt Cora." He took off his spectacles and cleaned them with the hem of his shirt, the gesture of a man buying himself a moment to choose his words with the care they required. "She wouldn't sell. I offered her a fair price, more than fair, given what most people thought the land was worth. She said the land wasn't for selling because she hadn't finished deciding what it was for." He set the spectacles back on his nose and looked at the deed on the counter. "I thought she was being sentimental. Land like that up near the falls, most people would have taken the cash and been grateful for the chance." Della said, "What changed your mind about her reasoning?" He looked at her steadily with the attention of a man who notices when a question is precise. "She died without telling me what she'd decided. That means either she never figured it out, which is possible, or she figured it out and ran out of time, which is also possible. Either way, the land is still there, and whatever she saw in it or thought she saw, that's still there too. It doesn't leave because the person who noticed it is gone." He paused. "Your Aunt Cora was not a sentimental woman. She was one of the most practically minded people I knew in 40 years of doing business in this county. When she held on to something, she held on to it because she had thought through the holding and decided it was the right position. I should have given that more credit at the time. Della was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Everyone calls it the Widowmaker." "Everyone calls it that," Gideon agreed. 3 men dead in 20 years. Bad terrain, permanent mist from the falls makes the rock treacherous for half the year. The approach from the valley isn't something you'd want to attempt in bad weather or bad light. I'm not going to pretend there's no basis for the reputation. He looked at her for a long moment across the counter. "But I will tell you this. I've traded in this county for 25 years, and I've seen land that looked promising and turned out to be nothing, and I've seen land that looked like nothing and turned out to be something that people couldn't believe they'd overlooked. The difference is almost never in the land itself. The difference is almost always in the person doing the looking and what they're willing to see when they look." He reached under the counter and pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil. "What do you need?" She told him. 1 good axe with a handle that fit a smaller grip, a bow saw, a sack of flour, salt, dried beans, a quantity of nails sorted by size, 2 coils of rope, 1 standard weight, 1 heavier for hauling. He wrote it down and calculated the total without commentary. She counted out her coins in 2 careful rows on the counter. He looked at the coins. He looked at what remained of her funds after the transaction. He said nothing about it. He packed her supplies without rushing, organizing the weight in the pack so that the heavier items sat closest to her back and the bag would ride without pulling. When he was done, he set the bundle on the counter. Then, without a word or a change in expression, he added a 2nd coil of rope, the heavy hauling weight, and did not write it in the ledger. He also added a small tin of waterproofed matches and a 1/2 pound of additional salt. She looked at him. He said, "The Widowmaker hasn't killed a woman yet. Make sure it stays that way. Now there is one thing about the debt document that will become important later, and it is worth understanding from the beginning how Gideon Pratt came to hold it. 3 months before this October morning before Cora died, before any of the events that put Della on this road, Orville Ware had come to Gideon's store after hours and asked for a private conversation about a loan. He needed money against an expected inheritance. Cora's estate, which he was certain he would receive and which he was already spending in his calculations. Gideon had been reluctant, but Orville had presented a guarantor document with Della's name signed to it, and had explained with the calm of a man stating a settled fact that his oldest daughter had agreed to stand as security. Gideon had not met with Della to confirm this because Orville had said she was working the far pasture and couldn't be reached that week, and because the amount was not so large as to require extraordinary caution, and because he had done business with the Ware family for 15 years, and had no particular reason yet to doubt what Orville told him. He wrote the loan. He held the document. He would not discover the forgery until the events of December placed him inside a chamber of rock and made him look at things he had not previously looked at closely enough. Della shouldered the pack. It was heavy in the way she had calculated it would be heavy, and she had decided in advance that weight was information rather than an obstacle. She walked out into the Aldgate morning. The road east out of Aldgate followed one of the creeks for the first several miles before climbing away from the water as the terrain rose toward the higher ridges. The valley floor gave way to granite shelves and root-crossed paths through stands of hickory and white oak, and the occasional persimmon, the trees all in full autumn color, red and deep gold, and the dark persistent green of the hemlocks that held their color regardless of what the season did around them. Under different circumstances, it would have been beautiful in the uncomplicated way that wilderness is beautiful, when you are not carrying 40 pounds on your back and walking towards something that the county considers a place to stay away from. Della walked. She was not a woman who talked to herself or filled silence with noise when noise served no purpose. She was a woman who processed the world through motion. She thought most clearly when she was moving, when her body was occupied with the physical problem of terrain, and her mind was free to work on whatever needed working on, without the interruption of sitting still. What needed working on was simple to state and complicated in its implications. She had a piece of land. Everyone who knew the land considered it worthless. She had money enough for perhaps 3 weeks of careful eating if she did not spend it on anything else, which meant she could not afford to leave the land once she reached it, because leaving meant spending money she did not have on a journey that would end with her no better position than she was now. She needed to reach the land. She needed to establish that she was there and was staying. She needed to find a way to survive on it through a winter that would begin at this elevation within 4 to 6 weeks of her arrival. How those things were possible given the land's reputation and the terrain and the season was a question she carried alongside her pack. She turned it over as she walked the way you work at a knot, not trying to pull it apart all at once, but finding the thread that had the most give, and starting there, then moving to the next patient, and sequential. She walked through the first day and camped that night in the shelter of a granite overhang above the creek, where the rock formed a natural lean-to that blocked the wind from the northwest and held the heat of a small fire better than open ground would have. She had done this before, slept outside in autumn on the mountain, not from choice but from necessity when farm work had kept her too far from the house to return before dark. She knew how to build a fire in a small space, and how to sleep close to it without getting close enough to be a danger, and how to wake before the cold became something that required more than a decision to stand up. She did these things efficiently and without drama, and she was moving again. Before full light, the pack loaded and balanced, the coals of the fire properly scattered. On the second day, the terrain changed in a way that was gradual and then sudden, the way important changes often are. The path had stopped being a road sometime the previous afternoon and become a path, and now it was becoming something less than a path, more like a strong suggestion, a record of where water had moved and rock had shifted over time. The ground pushed through the soil in ridges and shelves. The trees thinned and shortened as the elevation rose. The sound of water, which had been a distant presence since she left Aldgate, began to grow. It grew slowly at first, the way sound grows when you approach something large, not getting louder, exactly, but getting more present, more dimensional, occupying more of the space between the sounds of her own footsteps and the wind. Then it began to grow faster than the distance she was covering should explain. And then it changed in quality entirely. It stopped being sound in the ordinary sense. It became vibration. Della felt it in the soles of her boots before she heard it as something separate from the ambient noise of the world. A low, continuous tremor that moved up through the rock and into her feet and ankles and her shins and settled somewhere in the center of her chest. Not a heartbeat exactly, but something with a similar quality. The quality of something alive and ongoing and entirely indifferent to whether you were there or not. She came around a bend between 2 walls of granite and stopped. Calder Falls was not what she had imagined. She had imagined a waterfall, the way you imagine something you have only heard described by people who were frightened by it, something dramatic and vertical and obviously legibly dangerous. What she saw was all of that, but it was also something that descriptions of danger had not captured and perhaps could not capture. 50 feet of white water falling from the lip of a black basalt cliff in a single unbroken curtain, hitting the pool below with a force that turned the air for 20 feet in every direction into a permanent cloud of mist and spray. The sound was no longer something you heard and processed as separate from yourself. It lived in everything around her, in the rock under her feet, in the trees at her back, and the space between her thoughts. Beautiful. She noted that first with the part of her mind that noticed things regardless of their practical implications. Dangerous. She noted that second. The pool was deep and the edges were fast, where the impact of the falling water drove currents in complicated patterns. The ground around the pool was perpetually wet from the mist, and wet Appalachian basalt in October was among the more efficient means the mountain had available for ending a person's plans permanently. Useless. She stood there for a moment with that word, the word everyone used, the word that had been applied to this place by everyone who had looked at it and turned away. She held it up against what she was seeing and tried to make it fit. She could not. Because she was looking at the right side of the cliff face, the eastern wall, where the basalt angled slightly back from vertical instead of continuing straight down, and she was seeing something that nobody who had applied the word useless to this place had apparently considered worth mentioning. Behind the falls where the rock formed that inward angle, there was a dark shape that was not a shadow and not an optical effect of the mist. It was an opening. Not a crack, not a seam in the rock, not the kind of thing that moving water and long staring can produce as an illusion in certain light conditions. A real opening wide enough to matter, high enough to be useful, set back behind the curtain of falling water, at the exact angle that would make it invisible from every approach route except the one she was currently standing on. Della looked at the pool edge. Along the eastern side, just above the waterline, there was a natural shelf of flat rock, narrow, perhaps 18 inches at its widest, slick with the continuous mist, but continuous. It ran the full length of the pool edge from where she was standing to the base of the cliff. A passage. Not built, not maintained, not intended but navigable. If you were willing to move with care and accept that an error of balance would put you in water that was very cold and moving faster than it looked. She was willing. She adjusted the pack on her shoulders, tightened the straps, and moved to the edge of the shelf. She kept her weight low and slightly back, one hand trailing against the cliff face. Her eyes on the rock 2 feet ahead rather than on the pool to her left. The mist hit her immediately and completely. Within 30 seconds she was wet from the scalp, down the cold of it, sharp and pervasive in a way that focused rather than confused. The sound grew until it occupied the entirety of available space. She reached the edge of the water curtain. The falls were close enough here that she could feel the air pressure of the falling water against her face, a continuous push of displaced air that had its own temperature and its own smell, stone and cold and something older than either. On the other side of that curtain was the opening she had seen from across the pool. She ducked her head and stepped through. The silence was immediate. Not the silence of a closed room. That kind of silence still has the sounds of the world pressing against it from outside, audible in the walls and the floor, in the texture of the air itself. This was something of a different order. The silence of rock that had been in the same place for longer than anything alive in the valley below had a name. A silence so complete and so old that the waterfall, which she could see through the translucent curtain of water less than 6 feet away, see it still falling massive and continuous and entirely indifferent to her presence, seemed to belong to a different world entirely. Its sound was out there. She was in here. The boundary between those two worlds was a sheet of falling water 6 inches thick. She stood still for 30 seconds and let her mind adjust to the shift. Then she took out the small tin box of waterproofed matches she kept in her inner coat pocket and struck one, and in the small wavering light, she looked at what Calder Falls had been keeping to itself for longer than anyone in Claiborne County had thought to look. The chamber was large, larger than any interior space she had built an expectation around before stepping into it. The ceiling arched to perhaps 13 feet at the highest point, a natural vault of dark basalt that the water's perpetual moisture had coated over centuries in a thin mineral film, a calcite deposit that caught the match light and gave it back in fragments, like a room whose walls had been papered in dark mirrors. The floor was stone, polished smooth by water action over what must have been an enormous span of time, with pockets of fine sand accumulated in the more sheltered areas where the currents had deposited their load and left. The walls were solid. The air did not smell of rot of standing water, of the mineral heaviness that dead underground spaces accumulate. It smelled of stone, old stone and clean moving water, and something else beneath those, something quieter than smell, more like the quality of air in a place that has been in perfect undisturbed equilibrium for longer than human plans extend. She moved the match through the space before it burned out, reading the chamber, the way you read a room when you are trying to understand what it is and what it could be and what stands between those two things. A secondary passage opened to the right, lower ceilinged than the primary space, but fully navigable, leading to a second chamber that felt noticeably drier, the influence of the falls diminishing as distance from the water curtain increased. The floor there was compacted earth and fine gravel, firm and level underfoot. And then she found it. Along the lower wall of the primary chamber at approximately knee height, there was a horizontal seam in the rock where a thin thread of water ran across the stone surface, not dripping, not pooling, not the residue of the falls finding its way through the rock. Flowing, steadily, continuously flowing in a shallow channel that the stone itself had formed around it over time, shaped by the water to accommodate the water. And falling from the end of that channel into a natural basin in the floor, a depression that the water had slowly excavated from the bedrock over years that could not be easily counted. She crouched down and put one finger into the flow. Cold. Not the killing cold of the pool outside, the cold of deep rock, which holds the memory of the mountain's internal warmth, even when everything above it is moving toward winter. Clean in the way that things filtered through hundreds of feet of granite are clean, with no taste and no mineral sharpness and no quality of anything that had touched the surface world recently. A spring, a natural spring filtering through the mountain itself, moving through the rock by its own pressure, entirely independent of the falls above and the creek below and the weather above that. Water that owed nothing to any condition outside this chamber and would continue regardless of what those conditions were. Della sat back on her heels in the dark behind the water curtain and let the weight of what she was looking at settle into her understanding without rushing it. Water, shelter, stone walls that no weather could penetrate, temperature that the mountain would maintain with perfect autonomous consistency regardless of what the surface world did above it. A location that everyone who might conceivably want to take it from her considered worthless, and therefore not worth contesting. She sat there for a long time in the dark behind the falling water, while her mind moved through the implications the way her feet moved through difficult terrain, steadily, methodically, not rushing but not stopping either, committing to each step before reaching for the next. Then she reached into the inner pocket of her coat and touched the corner of the land deed she had been carrying since the previous evening. Her land? All of it, the falls, the pool, the rock shelf, the chamber behind the water, the spring inside the chamber. Hers. Because a man sitting in a fire-lit room had looked at a piece of paper and seen nothing worth the effort of keeping. She struck another match. In the new light, she found it. It was wedged into a deep horizontal crack in the eastern wall, roughly 4 feet above the floor, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth that had once been brown and was now the color of the stone around it, the two surfaces having exchanged something of their natures over the years they had been in contact. The bundle was small, the size of something you could hold in one hand without difficulty. She worked it loose from the crack carefully, the match burning down toward her fingers, and unwrapped the oilcloth on the floor of the chamber. Inside was a notebook, small leather bound, the leather cracked and darkened with the age and the particular humidity of the space it had been sitting in. She opened it carefully, the pages soft from moisture but intact, and held the last of the match close to the writing on the first page. The handwriting was her Aunt Cora's. She recognized it from the one letter Cora had written to the family 3 years ago, when she had been briefly ill, and had written to inform them that she expected to recover the letter like Cora herself, spare and functional, and not given to any word that was not carrying its full weight of meaning. But this was not a letter. The pages were covered in columns of numbers and small, precise sketches in measurements noted with the careful exactness of someone who was trying to record something they did not want to trust to memory alone. Temperature estimates for different points in the chamber across different seasons noted against what Cora had observed about the surface conditions outside at the time of each reading. Sketches of the water flow, patterns, the spring basin, the shape of the secondary chamber. Estimates of growing area and light levels at different times of year, based on careful observation of the angle and quality of light that came through the water curtain at various points in the day and the year. Cora had been here, not once, not twice, but many times across what appeared from the range of the seasonal observations to be several years. She had measured this place with the patience of someone who understood that useful knowledge requires time to accumulate and cannot be rushed without becoming less useful. She had mapped it. She had thought through its possibilities with the same practical, unglamorous intelligence that Gideon Pratt had in his morning's conversation. Attributed to her without using the word intelligence, she had been building towards something specific. And then she had stopped. The last entries in the notebook were dated 18 months before Cora's death. After that, nothing, the remaining pages blank, waiting for observations that had never been recorded. And at the back of the notebook, Della could see from the ragged stubs remaining at the binding that the last several pages had been deliberately removed. Whatever Cora had written at the end, she had taken it out before hiding the notebook here. Why she stopped coming, why she had hidden the notebook rather than keeping it at home, why the last pages were gone. These were questions that the notebook as it existed could not answer. Della sat in the dark behind Calder Falls with her aunt's unfinished work in her hands, and she understood something that had not been available to her when she was standing in the firelit room the previous evening with a piece of paper held out to her like the conclusion of something. It was not the conclusion of something. It was the middle of something. Cora had started something here and had not finished it for reasons that might never be fully known. The notebook was not the record of a failure. It was the record of someone who had seen what was here and had begun to understand it and had intended to continue, and who had left the understanding behind in the most protected location she had found, as though she knew that the understanding itself needed to be preserved even if she could not continue the work. It was the beginning of a map, left for someone who might come looking. Della closed the notebook. She put it in her coat pocket next to the land deed. Then she went back out through the water curtain and stood on the flat rock shelf with the mist soaking into her already soaked clothing, and the sound of the falls filling every available space in the world. And she looked at the slope above the chamber entrance, 20 feet of relatively flat ground sheltered by the rock overhang, protected from wind by the cliff face, protected from casual approach by the falls themselves. A site, the place to build. She was 21 years old. She had a good axe and a bow saw and a sack of flour and dried beans and $19 and a notebook full of someone else's careful unfinished work, and a piece of land that every sensible person in Claiborne County had agreed was worth nothing. She had never built a structure of any kind. She had never felled a standing tree. She had never laid a foundation or set a chimney stone or worked out the weight distribution of a roof. She picked up her pack and began to walk up the slope to look at the trees. The first tree took her most of a morning. She had watched men fell trees, her father, her uncle, the men who came to cut timber on the lower pasture when she was 12 years old, and the farm needed money, more than it needed the stand of oak at the field's edge. She had watched the way they stood with their feet spread and their weight forward. The way they read the lean of the trunk before committing to the first cut, assessing it from multiple angles, not hurrying that assessment. The way they used the weight of the axe rather than fighting against it, letting the tool's own mass do the work that arm strength alone could not do efficiently. She remembered all of that with the precise clarity she brought to anything she had decided was worth remembering for later use. Memory and execution turned out to be separated by a distance that was significant and humbling. The first 3 blows bounced off the wet wood at angles she had not intended. The 4th went in but wrong the entry angle, creating a cut geometry that would have the tree falling directly across the path she needed it to fall away from. She stopped. She set the axe down against a nearby rock. She sat on that rock and looked at the tree for a long time, the way she was beginning to understand her Aunt Cora had looked at the chamber as a problem that had a solution available to it. If you were willing to look long enough to find the solution, rather than trying to impose a solution you had brought with you, she found it in the lean of the trunk, which was slight but real and consistent, if you looked at it from 3 positions rather than 1. She found it in the root structure, which on the uphill side was exposed enough by years of erosion to tell her something about where the tree's center of mass actually sat. She found it in the angle of the morning light, which told her which side of the trunk had been drying in the sun through the summer, and would therefore be more responsive to the blade. She went back to work. The tree fell where she needed it to fall. The sound it made when it hit the ground was enormous, a deep concussion that traveled through the rock itself and up through her feet and into her chest. And for a moment she stood beside the fallen trunk with both things present simultaneously, the fear that comes from the scale and the irreversibility of what you have just done, and something very close to its opposite. A satisfaction that had nothing to do with how she felt about herself and everything to do with what was now possible that had not been possible 30 seconds ago. The first log was the hardest. The second was merely difficult. The third was the day she began to understand what the work actually was, as opposed to what she had imagined it would be from the outside. She moved to the logs using the ropes and a system of branch levers and smaller branches laid crosswise as rollers, a method she worked out by trial and modification over the first 2 days, keeping what worked and discarding what didn't, with the same dispassion she would apply to any other data. Progress was measured in feet and hours. The body kept its own accounting of the labor, recording it in the shoulders and the hands and the deep muscles of the back. But she had learned early in her life that the body's accounting, while honest, was not the final authority on what was achievable. She built the cabin against the cliff face, using the basalt wall as the structure's rear and eastern sides, needing to construct only 2 walls and a roof rather than 4. This reduced both the timber required and the time needed, and it placed the structure directly above the chamber entrance, so that the same rock overhang that sheltered the cabin exterior also sheltered the approach to the cave below. The cabin was 12 feet by 8 feet, small enough that the body heat of a single person could maintain it against the cold, large enough to work and sleep in without the space becoming a source of difficulty. The gaps between the logs she filled with a mixture of clay-rich soil and dried grass and water from the spring, a cold, slow, unpleasant work that she did on her knees in the October chill, pressing the material into every gap with her fingers, testing each completed section with her palm for the whisper of moving air that would indicate an unsealed space. When she pressed her ear to the completed section of wall, and the whistle of outside wind was gone, not reduced. But gone, the cabin stopped being a collection of materials she had assembled and became something else. A place with an inside and an outside, a place where inside was different from outside in a way that mattered. The chimney was the most consequential part and the most demanding. She built it from flat stones gathered from the creek bed below, stones that had been shaped by water over long periods into the kind of flat, stackable forms that made good building material, set in the same clay mortar she had used between the logs, rising from the back corner of the cabin through a natural crack in the basalt cliff face that she widened carefully with her knife used as a chisel and a heavy water-rounded stone used as a mallet, working slowly and checking often to ensure she was following the crack rather than creating new fractures in the rock. The first fire she built in it filled the cabin with smoke so dense it drove her outside, coughing, her eyes burning for an hour after. She stood in the cold and looked at the chimney from the outside, and identified the problem, a bend in the natural crack where the passage narrowed, creating a pocket where the smoke was pooling, rather than drawing upward. She cleared the blockage with a long stick and then added a flat capstone on the exterior, positioned at an angle over the chimney opening to create the pressure differential that would pull air up through the flue. She built the fire a second time. The flames went straight up without hesitation. The smoke followed. The heat began to move into the cabin like something that had been waiting for permission, reaching into the corners, settling against the walls, finding the cold places and replacing them one by one. She sat down on the floor in front of the fire and did not move for a long time. Her hands were blistered on the palms and the inside of 3 fingers. Her shoulders had a deep structural ache that she recognized as the kind that took days rather than hours to resolve. Her back reported a similar condition. She was hungry in a way that the small fire she'd been cooking over in the evenings had not been adequately addressing. She was also, and this was the thing she sat with longest in the firelight, completely without fear of this place. Not because she had mastered it, she had barely started. Not because the work was done, the work would not be close to done for weeks. But because she understood it now in a way she had not understood it when she was standing at a distance looking at it. She understood its rhythms and its materials and the particular ways it could be worked with rather than against. She understood the falls the way their sound changed with the weather above, the pattern of the mist and how it moved differently in different winds. She understood the chamber and the spring and the specific quality of the silence behind the water curtain, a silence that was not absence but presence, the presence of old stone doing what old stone does without any interest in what you think about it. 3 weeks since she had arrived. She went into the chamber every morning. She had carried the soil up from the creek bank below, baskets woven from creek willow, trip after trip down the slope and back, each trip a measured expenditure of energy against a calculated return. She had laid the soil in raised beds along the chamber walls where Cora's notebook indicated the light from the water curtain fell at the most useful angle through the longest portion of the day. She had planted what she had brought from Aldgate lettuce carrots, the cold, hardy onion variety she had read about in an almanac her father kept for weather predictions and had never used for anything else. Small, considered investments in a long game that she did not yet know she would win. She watered them with spring water every morning. She watched the soil and touched it and read it the way she was beginning to read everything at Calder Falls with her full attention, without hurrying the information it was willing to give her at its own pace. And then the footsteps came. She was splitting wood on the flat ground above the cabin, on a morning in late November when she heard them, someone moving on the lower path, the approach trail that came up from the valley floor. The sound was not cautious. It was the sound of someone who was tired past the point of having reserves for caution, moving because stopping was not an acceptable option, rather than because moving was easy. She set the axe down against the woodpile and stood still and waited. The figure that came around the last bend in the path was smaller than she expected, and moving with the particular economy of motion that the body produces when it is operating below its preferred margins, not injured, not quite, but close to the edge of what it could sustain without rest and warmth and food in that order. Nessa Ware, 19 years old. Her hair was in the same 2 braids she had worn since they were children, and she had the small leather pack on her back, the pack she had kept under her bed at the house for as long as Della could remember, as though she had always expected that the day would come when she would need to pick it up and leave without time to prepare. She stopped in front of Della and looked at the cabin at the chimney with its thin thread of smoke, at the woodpile at the path leading down to the chamber entrance. She looked at all of it, with the steady, thorough attention of someone who had expected to find either nothing or something, and had found something and was now engaged in the work of understanding what specific form that something had taken. Then she looked at Della. She said, "Pa sent both of us away, different reasons, same result." She paused, then, "I knew where you were going." Della looked at her. She did not ask about the reasons. She had a sufficiently complete understanding of Orville Ware to construct the probable shape of what had happened, and the specific reasons were less important right now than the fact of the person standing in front of her. "Are you hungry?" she said. Nessa said yes. Della turned toward the cabin. Nessa followed. But as she crossed the threshold and stopped inside looking at the sleeping loft, the fire, the tools arranged against the wall in order of frequency of use, the small shelf with the supplies organized by weight and type, something happened in her expression, something between recognition and a feeling she did not have a ready name for, something that had to do with realizing that what you find is not always what you expected to find. Then she reached into her pack and took out a small envelope, sealed. Della's name on the front in Orville's handwriting. "He gave me that before I left," Nessa said. Her voice was steady in the way of someone who has been carrying something they did not open because they understood it was not theirs to open. "I didn't read it." Della took the envelope. She set it on the shelf and looked at it. Then she opened it. The paper inside was a single folded sheet, a legal document formally worded. A debt acknowledgement. Orville Ware owed $340 to a creditor in Aldgate. At the bottom of the document, in the space provided for a guarantor's signature, Orville had signed Della's name. She had not signed it. She had not been asked. She had not been present when the document was created. But her name was there in her father's handwriting, binding her to a debt she had never agreed to, in an amount she had no means of meeting. She read it twice. She set it back on the shelf. She turned to the fireplace and added a log that did not need to be added yet, because she needed a moment with her back to the room and her face to the fire. Orville Ware had not simply given away a piece of land he considered worthless, and sent away a daughter he had decided was inconvenient. He had attached a financial claim to her name that could be called in at any time by whoever held the corresponding document in Aldgate, a claim that would follow her wherever she went. A claim she had no means of contesting without revealing the forgery, which would require a legal process. She had neither the money nor the standing to pursue. He had sent her away and attached a leash to her ankle as she went out the door, fine enough that she might not notice it until the day someone decided to pull it. The fire took the log and burned with the same steadiness it always burned with. The spring in the chamber ran its thin thread of clean water into its stone basin. The falls outside filled the world with their permanent layered sound. Nessa had not spoken. She was watching Della with the precise, undemanding attention she had always brought to situations where speaking would interfere with something more important. The attention of someone who understood that some silences needed to be left undisturbed until they were ready to become something else. Della turned around. She said, "There's something I need to show you." She took Nessa into the chamber. She watched her sister stop in the immediate silence and go still, not from fear but from the sudden presence of something the senses were not prepared for. She watched Nessa look at the vaulted ceiling, at the spring running in its channel, at the raised beds with their first thin showing of green coming up through the dark soil. Then Nessa reached into her pack for the second time and took out a small notebook, blank new, bought with money she had apparently been saving, and a pencil. She looked at Della. "The temperature varies across the chamber," she said. "You can see it from the way the moisture sits differently on different sections of wall. Has anyone mapped it precisely? Della looked at her sister for a moment. She said no. Start wherever you want. Outside, the falls came down as they had come down for longer than anything in the valley had a name for. The sound filled the world and did not stop and did not vary and did not concern itself in the vast and total self-sufficiency of moving water with anything that human hands might build or plan in the rock behind it. November arrived the way serious things arrive without announcement, without the consideration of preparation time. One morning the temperature dropped 12 degrees between dawn and midday, and by evening the first hard frost had taken the ground and held it, and Claiborne County understood that the season it had been progressing toward had arrived and would remain until it decided otherwise. Inside the chamber behind Calder Falls, none of that was true. The temperature in the primary space held at what Nessa calculated through a week of careful morning and evening measurements using the small thermometer she had brought in her pack. One of the few objects she owned that had cost real money, purchased 3 years ago from a traveling instrument merchant and kept wrapped in flannel cloth ever since, against the possibility that it might someday be necessary. The readings clustered between 46 and 52 degrees Fahrenheit, varying by position within the chamber rather than by time of day, or by what the weather was doing on the surface above. The secondary chamber, deeper in the rock and further from the water curtain's influence, ran consistently cooler and significantly drier. Nessa mapped all of it with the focused pleasure of someone watching a hypothesis produce confirmable results. She marked temperature zones in different shadings in her notebook. She noted moisture gradients along the walls at measured intervals. She recorded the angle of light through the water curtain at different times of day and in different cloud conditions, paying particular attention to how cloud cover changed the quality and quantity of light reaching the growing beds. By the end of 2 weeks, she had produced a document that told anyone who could read it exactly what the chamber was doing at any point within it at any time of year, not from theory but from measurement taken in the place itself. Della watched her sister work and understood something she had not fully understood before. They were not the same person at different ages, not versions of the same instrument. They were different instruments reading the same place Della through her hands and her feet in her capacity for sustained physical effort, her ability to look at a material problem and find the practical solution available within the constraints of what actually existed. Nessa, through her eyes and her measurements and her instinct for patterns that lived in numbers and ratios and the relationships between things rather than in the things themselves. The chamber needed both of those modes. The work required both of those minds. What Della had built alone in 6 weeks was functional. What they built together in the weeks that followed was systematic, each adjustment informed by Nessa's measurements, each measurement made possible by the physical infrastructure Della had established. The growing beds were reorganized according to the temperature map. Cold-tolerant roots moved to the cooler sections nearer the secondary chamber. The leafy greens and faster-growing plants kept in the primary space, where both temperature and light access were most favorable. The spring basin was deepened and widened by handwork with a flat stone chisel Della fashioned from creek rock, the process slow and requiring more patience than most tasks she had attempted, until the basin held a full day's supply without overflow. A drainage channel cut at the low end directed the overflow toward the far wall where the rock was solid, and the water could run down without reaching anything that needed to stay dry. In early December, Della made the trip back to Aldgate. She walked down from Calder Falls in the cold of a morning when the frost had taken everything the eye could reach and turned it white and still. She took the valley road into town and pushed open the door of Gideon Pratt's general store with the particular manner of someone who has spent 6 weeks doing difficult things and has consequently revised their understanding of what difficult means. Gideon looked up from behind his counter. He looked at her hands first, the new calluses on the palm the changed texture of the skin, and then at her face, and whatever he found there made him set down the pencil he was holding with a deliberateness that suggested he had decided this conversation was going to require his full attention. She needed 4 laying hens, a milk goat, 2 ewes, and a ram if he had one available, and 2 blocks of salt. She set her remaining money on the counter. He counted it. He told her it was close to enough, but not quite. She nodded and reached into her coat and placed down 3 additional coins money she had earned on the road coming down. Stopping at a farm where a man's fence line had come apart in the early frost, and he had needed 2 hours of post-setting work completed before he could move his stock to the lower pasture. Gideon looked at all of it together and counted again. Then he began writing in his ledger. She brought the animals back up the mountain in the late afternoon of a December day, when the sky had the color of old iron and the wind off the high ridge carried the specific edge of wind that has traveled over open stone for a long distance without interruption. The hens in their wooden traveling crate complained at every irregularity in the path with professional persistence. The ewes stopped without visible reason at intervals and required patient coaxing to resume movement. The goat was better company, curious and self-possessed, investigating the trail with the calm attentiveness of an animal that had decided the journey was interesting. When the shape of Calder Falls appeared through the bare trees, white against the darkening stone, all of the animals stopped simultaneously. The sound of the falls reached them as something they had no category for, large and continuous and sourceless, a presence without a body. The goat considered it with her ears forward for a long moment. Then she turned her head toward Della with an expression that asked without hostility whether this was where they were going. Della crouched beside the smaller ewe and spoke to her in the low, uninflected rhythm she had found worked better than either silence or reassurance. Not words exactly, more the shape and pace of words without urgency. After 2 minutes, the ew's breathing changed and she moved forward on her own. The others followed. Inside the chamber, something that had been incomplete became complete. The space received them and changed in quality, textured now, with sound and warmth and the particular living presence of animals at rest in a place they have decided is adequate. The hens investigated the perimeter with professional thoroughness. The ewes found the piled hay and settled into it with the conviction of creatures who have made a decision and are finished deliberating. The goat stood in the center of the primary chamber and looked at the water curtain for a long time before she lay down, apparently satisfied. Nessa was standing near the spring, watching all of it. She wrote something in her notebook and did not explain what. The first egg appeared on the morning of the 3rd week of December. Della found it on her morning check of the chamber, tucked between 2 flat stones near the eastern wall, in a spot that suggested the hen had formed preferences about privacy. She stood holding it in both palms and felt the small weight of it, the warmth it still held. She held it the way you hold something that stands for more than its size, suggests not for its monetary value, which was small, but for what it indicated about the system she had built. It was working. The first goat milk came 2 days later. Della drank half of it, standing next to the goat without ceremony, and felt it register in a body that had been running on dried beans and flour bread for 6 weeks as something approaching luxury in its most fundamental form. She was making a list in her mind of what still needed doing, when she noticed that the sound of the falls had changed. She was in the sleeping loft in the early hours of a December night when she became aware of it. Not a sudden awareness, the kind that wakes you fully in an instant, but the gradual surfacing of something her sleeping mind had been tracking and had finally decided required her conscious attention. The falls had been her constant companion for 2 months. So constant, she had long since stopped processing it as something separate from the background state of the world. But now, something in it was different. The pitch had dropped. The rhythm had changed. There was a percussive quality in it now, intermittent, like something being struck with force rather than something falling continuously. She was through the cabin door before she had fully assembled the thought that had moved her. The night was clear, and the cold was the kind of cold that has stopped trying to hide what it is. What she saw when she reached the edge of the rock shelf stopped her. Calder Falls had tripled. The water coming over the lip of the basalt cliff was not the familiar curtain she had been living beside. It was a wall, a moving mass of black water in the moonlight that hit the pool below with a force that sent spray to the height of the tallest trees nearby and created a sound that was no longer separable into components. Rain somewhere on the high ridge above, more rain than the rock could absorb and the ground could drain. All of it converging at the same lip of basalt and going over together in a volume that had remade the character of the falls entirely. The flat rock shelf along the pool's eastern edge, the 18-inch passage she used every day to enter and exit the chamber, was gone. The pool had risen. The water covered the shelf completely. Where the water met the cliff face, it met it with force rather than resting against it. The chamber entrance was sealed. She stood in the cold and worked through the implications in order the way she worked through any problem, by identifying what was true first and what could be done second without mixing those two steps together. Nessa and the animals were inside. The food stores, the spring, the chamber itself, all sealed behind what had become an impassable barrier in the space of a few hours. The cabin was outside here on the shelf of ground above the falls. She was outside. She went back into the cabin, checked the door seal against the cold, checked the chimney draw, built the fire to a level that would maintain warmth through sustained cold without requiring constant attention. Assessed the cabin's contents: food for 3 days, 4 if she was careful. Firewood stacked under the overhang adequate. Water from a small catchment she had built on the cabin's north face sufficient. Then she went back outside and walked the full perimeter of the rock shelf east to the point where the cliff face met a secondary granite outcropping she had noticed in her first weeks of exploring the terrain. In the junction between the cliff and the outcrop, there was a narrow slot, not a path, not something that invited passage, but a navigable gap between two rock faces that required moving sideways in places, and accepting that the stone would be cold against your front and your back simultaneously. It went around the eastern end of the pool and down to the creek below. She had cleared the loose rock from the slot in October, working through a morning for no specific reason she had articulated to herself at the time. She had been learning the terrain, wanting to understand every feature of the ground she was responsible for, and the slot had needed clearing, so she had cleared it. She had kept it passable through the weeks since, without knowing she was keeping it passable for a situation exactly like this one. She noted this and went back inside. The night passed. The falls maintained their new, enormous volume. She slept in the cabin in the cold and woke early and did the work the day required within the space available to her. On the third day, she heard something through the falls. She had learned to hear through them over 2 months of living beside them, to distinguish sounds from within the constant presence of the water. The way you learn to read handwriting you have encountered enough times to know its particular shapes. This was different from the usual sounds. Intermittent, irregular, coming from the direction of the eastern slot passage. She pulled on her coat and went outside. The sound resolved as she approached it into knocking. Weak and slow and too widely spaced, the knocking of someone who had very little left to knock with, who was doing it anyway because it was the remaining option. She went through the eastern slot sideways, the cold stone against her coat front and back, and came out on the other side and looked down the slope. Pastor Lemuel Croft was 40 feet below, leaning against the rock outcropping with both palms flat against the stone and his head down, his body doing the work of a system running on its final reserves. He was 58 years old and had been the minister of Aldgate's church for 22 years, which meant Della knew him by sight, if not by close acquaintance. His coat was insufficient for the conditions he had encountered, a man who had left for what he expected to be a day's journey, and had found something the length of days that his preparation had not accounted for. His lips had the color of things that have been cold too long. His hands were white at the knuckles and blue at the fingertips. She covered the 40 feet in 15 seconds, got under his right arm, and took the weight of him onto her shoulder and started moving before she spoke, because moving was more immediately necessary than any exchange of words. "I saw the smoke," he said. His voice had the quality of something produced at significant cost. "From the chimney 3 days ago." "Keep walking," she said. "I thought it was a fire. I didn't know anyone was here." "Keep walking." She got him through the eastern slot, difficult because he was not a small man, and the passage required coordination that he did not currently have in full measure, and across the rock shelf and through the cabin door. She sat him in the chair by the fire. She pulled his boots off. The socks beneath were soaked through, and the skin of his feet had the waxy, unresponsive look of tissue that has been deprived of adequate circulation for an extended period. She put flat stones from the fire surround, heated but not hot enough to burn, wrapped in dry cloth against the soles of his feet. She heated water and added the last of the wild honey she had collected from a hive in October. She made food beans that had been soaking, cooked with salt, and a measure of rendered fat she had saved from an earlier slaughter. Nothing elaborate, everything necessary. When the color began to return to his face, Pastor Croft looked around the cabin with the eyes of someone assessing where he was and what it meant. Then he looked toward the chamber entrance, which was open and visible from where he sat. He said, "You're actually living here?" "Yes." "In the cave." "The cave is the most important part. The cabin is the entrance to it." He absorbed this. Then he said, with the tone of a man who has decided that something needs to be said and has decided to say it plainly, "There is something you should know about the land and about your father." He told her everything he knew. He told her without softening it, because he believed she was owed the plain version. Orville Ware had gone to Knoxville the previous spring before Cora was sick, before any of the events that had led to this moment, and had met with the principals of a company called Greer & Sons, a mineral extraction and land development operation with interests across the eastern Tennessee Ridge country. He had proposed selling them the Calder Falls land, which he expected to inherit from his sister Cora. They had expressed interest. A survey had been conducted in August while Cora was still alive and without her knowledge. Greer & Sons had determined that the terrain was too complex and too remote for economical extraction at that time, and had declined. When Cora died and the estate came to Orville, he had transferred the Calder Falls parcel to Della, rather than holding it himself, because a piece of land he could not sell, and had no use for, had value only as a means of solving a different problem, and giving it to Della had solved two problems simultaneously. If she failed to make anything of it and left, which Orville had calculated as the near certain outcome, the land would revert under county abandonment statutes to prior claim after a sufficient period. Prior claim meant Orville. Orville could then approach Greer & Sons again at whatever future point the company reconsidered its position on the property with a clean title and a straightforward transaction. He had also separately borrowed money against the expectation of this eventual outcome, using a guarantee document he had signed with Della's name, a document the creditor in Aldgate held, and which Della would not be in a position to contest without revealing a forgery that a county court would likely consider her word against his. Della listened to all of this with her hands resting on her knees and her eyes on the fire. When he finished, she said nothing for a long time. The fire burned. The falls outside maintained their new volume. The wind moved through the rocks above with the sounds rocks allow wind to make. She understood the shape of what she was standing inside now. Not just a piece of land she had come to make something of. A position in a plan that had been set up before she arrived, designed to use her failure as the mechanism of its completion. If she stayed and failed, her father won through the reversion. If she stayed and succeeded, she held something he had intended to sell, and her success had made it worth considerably more than Greer and Sons had originally determined. Her father had played a long, patient game. He had cast her as the piece he expected to sacrifice without her knowledge of the game's existence. She sat with the full weight of this understanding until it had resolved from something sharp and hot into something she could carry without it changing the way she stood. Then she said, "Thank you for telling me." Pastor Croft looked at her with the particular attention of a man who has told a great many people difficult things and has learned to read what the telling does to them. He said, "Most people need time to find their footing after news like that." She said, "I found it before you walked in. I've been standing on it for 2 months." He said, "What can I do?" She told him, "Rest, eat. Tomorrow I have work in the chamber and I'll need someone to maintain the fire in the cabin while I'm inside." He nodded once. He ate. He slept in the chair by the fire and she slept in the loft, and the falls did what they did without any investment in either of them. The second storm came on the 5th day. Della had read it in the pressure of the air the previous evening, and in the particular stillness that preceded large events, the way the smaller sounds of the forest shut down, first the birds going quiet before the wind changed. She had spent the intervening day in preparation, more firewood inside water jugs filled from the chamber spring, and multiple trips through the eastern slot passage, the cabin door repacked with fresh clay at every gap. When the storm came, it came as the mountain had promised it would. She heard the voices on the 2nd day of it. Through the falls, and through the wind, and through the dense pressing weight of what was falling from the sky, there were voices, fragments of sound arriving in the intervals between the storm's largest expressions, too shaped to be wind, too irregular to be anything but human. She was moving before she had consciously decided to move, coat already in her hands, not pausing to explain herself to Pastor Croft, who was awake and watching from the chair. Through the eastern slot, slower now, ice having formed on the rock surfaces, and out into a world that was white in every direction and loud, with a sound that made direction itself uncertain. She stood still and listened the way she had learned to listen in the chamber, not for the loudest signal, but for what was underneath the loudest signal. Northeast, 100 yards, perhaps a little more. She found them under a granite shelf that jutted from the ridge face and provided coverage from above, but nothing from the wind which came from the side, with the insistence of wind that has committed to a direction and is not reconsidering. 2 figures. Harriet Voss, the schoolteacher from Aldgate. Della recognized her by her build and her coat, and a child of 8, pressed against her mother's side with the stillness of someone who has stopped shivering. Stopping shivering was the more serious condition. The body stops that effort when it no longer has the reserves to make the effort worth making. Della got under Harriet's free arm. She said, "Walk. Don't stop moving. Don't talk until you're inside." Harriet Voss gave one nod, the nod of a person who is past having opinions about instructions. Della set the pace, fast enough that the cold could not gain additional ground, slow enough that the child Wren, 8 years old, whose name Della would learn later, could maintain it without falling. She counted her steps through the white noise of the storm, using the count to prevent the spatial disorientation that heavy snowfall in familiar terrain can still produce if you let your attention drift. At the right number, she turned left, found the eastern outcrop with her extended hand, moved them through the slot passage. The cabin door opened. The heat struck the incoming cold and the incoming body simultaneously. Wren made a small, involuntary sound. Harriet Voss's legs tried to give way under her, and Della held her weight until Pastor Croft, who had already moved the second chair to the fire with the understanding of a man who grasped what was happening, could take her other side. Within 10 minutes, Wren began to shiver again. Della watched this happen and felt a specific relief. The relief of watching a body resume its argument with the cold, because the argument required energy, and the energy required that the argument was still worth making. Harriet Voss sat with her daughter's hands between her own and watched the fire for a long time. When she finally looked up and looked around and began to understand the space she was in, the fitted walls, the chimney drawing cleanly the organized supplies, the chamber entrance with its sounds of animals and warmth coming through from below, her expression changed in a way Della noted and did not comment on. It was the expression of someone correcting a map they had been navigating by for a long time. Not a dramatic correction. The quiet, internal kind that changes everything about the navigation going forward without requiring announcement. On the 4th day of the new storm, Gideon Pratt arrived. He came with 2 men from Aldgate who had shovels and the unhurried practicality of people doing something necessary in conditions that weren't going to improve by waiting. They had been opening the valley road and then the lower path and then the climb for 2 days because Pastor Croft had been absent long enough that his absence had become a fact requiring response, rather than a condition requiring patience. Gideon came through the eastern slot last, his coat white and his face carrying the patience of someone who has been outside in hard weather enough times to have stopped spending energy on opinions about it. He stepped into the cabin and stopped. He looked at Pastor Croft, alive and warm and eating from a bowl. He looked at Harriet Voss and Wren, alive and recovering. He looked at the cabin, the walls that were holding the chimney that had been drawing correctly, through one of the worst storms in 5 years, the organized arrangement of everything according to its purpose. Then Della led him into the chamber. He went in slowly. He stood in the silence that stopped every person who encountered it for the first time, that required a moment of reorientation because it was unlike any silence available above ground. And he looked at the ceiling, the spring in its channel, the growing beds, the temperature maps Nessa had pinned to the wall near the spring, the animals in their organized space with their hay and their warmth. He looked at all of it for a long time. Then he sat down on the flat rock near the spring and was quiet in the way of a man engaged in the interior work of revising something that has been arranged one way for a long time and needs to be arranged differently going forward. He said, "I told you this was rock and water. That's what I said to you." She said nothing. "I was half right," he said. "The water was here. That part I got correct." He looked at the spring. "What I didn't see was what the water meant, what someone with the right kind of eyes could make it mean." He looked up at her. "There is something I need to tell you," he said. His voice had changed the tone of a man who has arrived at the part of a conversation he did not come to have, but has decided he is obligated to have. "About the dead document your father signed with your name." He reached into his coat and took out a folded paper. He placed it on the rock between them. It was the debt document. The copy the creditor held formal notarized. He looked at it and then at her. "I am the creditor," he said. "Your father borrowed money from me against an expected inheritance, and he put your name to the guarantee because he believed your name was worth nothing as a practical matter, and that using it would cost him nothing." He paused. "He came to me before you left, told me you had agreed to serve as guarantor, but were working the far pasture and couldn't come into town to sign in person. I accepted that." "I should not have accepted that without meeting with you directly, and I did not, and that was my error as much as his deception." She looked at the document. She looked at him. "I can call that debt today," he said. "You have no means of meeting it, and we both understand that. Or I can take this document and destroy it in exchange for the right to send my nephew Clem here in the spring to learn what you've built and how it works. He's 18 years old. He has a good mind that I am currently wasting on inventory counts. This is not charity and it is not a favor. It is a transaction between two people who understand what they are exchanging. She held his gaze for a moment, the full direct attention she brought to anything she needed to read accurately. She said, "Destroy it." Gideon took the document in both hands and tore it once across and then again, and set the pieces on the flat stone between them. He nodded once. She nodded once. No additional words were required by either party. She picked up the torn pieces. She walked to the small tin box she kept on the far wall ledge for things that needed to be kept opened. It placed the pieces inside and closed the lid. Not because she needed to keep them, because some destructions should leave evidence of themselves. She walked back to where Gideon was still sitting. He said, "When the path's clear, I'll tell people what I saw here." "Tell them what you saw," she said. "Nothing more than that." He looked at her. "Some of them won't believe it." "Tell them anyway," she said. "What people choose to believe doesn't change what's in this chamber." He stood up slowly with the deliberateness of a man whose body maintains its own careful accounting of the years. He looked once more around the chamber at the growing beds, the maps, the spring, the organized order of a space that had been built from nothing by one person and made more precise by two. He said, "Cora Ware used to say that most people look at a thing and see only what it already is. She said she always had to fight the habit in herself." He paused. "I thought she was talking about philosophy. I understand now she was talking about something practical." He looked at Della. She was right, and so was her judgment about where to leave what she knew. He walked toward the water curtain and passed through it back into the world of sound, and Della stood in the silence of the chamber while the animals breathed and the spring ran and the light through the curtain shifted with the sky above, moving through its colors as the storm continued its withdrawal. She stood there for a while. Then she went to check the growing beds. The lettuce in the primary zone had put out new leaves overnight, pale from the filtered light but real-oriented toward the water curtain with the unhurried certainty of living things that have found the conditions they need and are making the most of them. The carrot tops were present. The onions had begun to send up their next layer. She touched the soil and read its moisture and decided it did not need water yet. Tomorrow she would have work to do, the same work she had been doing with the same hands in the same place. She had come here with $19 and a dead woman's unfinished notes, and someone had constructed a trap around the land before she arrived, and she had built something inside the trap that had made the trap irrelevant to everything that mattered. She was 21 years old. She went to start the evening fire. Spring came to Calder Falls the way it came to all high places in the Appalachian country, reluctantly in stages, as though the mountain required convincing before it would permit the season to proceed. The snow thinned first from the ridge line, then from the southern slopes, then from the valley floor, and finally from the ground immediately around the falls, where the mist kept everything cold and wet longer than the surrounding terrain would have required on its own. But when the sun's angle changed, when the light that came through the water curtain each midday shifted from the low, committed gray of winter to something more direct, more willing, the chamber behind Calder Falls understood this before anything outside it did. Della noticed it on a morning in late February. The light through the water was different, not dramatically the way a familiar voice sounds different when the person speaking it has slept well. Same source, something altered in it, a quality of reach of genuine warmth that had not been present the day before. The growing beds noticed it before she could measure the difference. The lettuce, which had been producing steadily through the winter in its careful, muted way, leaves smaller than surface-grown plants, the green of them, restrained the growth, measured in days, began to change within a week of that first altered light. The color deepened toward what it was supposed to be. The leaves broadened. The plants put out new growth with a speed that made the change visible between a dawn check and a midday one. Nessa was there with her notebook every morning, recording measurements with the satisfaction of someone watching a theory produce a fact. The temperature readings she had taken through 4 months of winter, the light estimates she had made by counting hours and noting cloud conditions, all of it now producing results that aligned with what her calculations had suggested they should produce. The onions sent up new stalks. The carrot shoulders broke the soil surface orange and firm and real. The beans Della had planted in the outdoor beds, now sheltered by the timber and stone overhang she and Nessa had constructed along the cabin's eastern face in October, began to climb their branch stakes with the quiet ambition of things that understand exactly what they are for. The goat's milk production increased with the lengthening days from less than a cup each morning to nearly a quart. The ewes had given birth in January 2 lambs that had come into the world inside the chamber in its warmth, and had learned to walk on stone floors and to treat the sound of the falls as the natural background of existence. They were strong animals, growing quickly on their mother's milk, and the hay Della carried up from the valley meadow below in loads that her body accepted now with a matter-of-factness that would have been unimaginable to the person who had arrived here in October. The hens produced eggs with a regularity that Della had stopped thinking of as uncertain. It was a fact now, a component of the system's daily output to be planned around rather than hoped for. The system was working, not as a collection of separate independent efforts that happened to occupy the same space, but as a thing with its own logic and its own momentum, each element generating conditions that supported other elements, the whole more stable than any of its parts would have been alone. The animals produced warmth that benefited the growing beds. The growing beds would eventually supplement the animals' diet. The spring provided water independent of any weather event or seasonal condition. The rock provided temperature stability that required no fuel and no maintenance and no decision from anyone. Della walked through it each morning and noted what it needed and provided what it needed, and it returned more than it consumed. In March, Edna Sutter came. Edna Sutter was 70 years old and had lived in the Appalachian Hill Country for every one of those years, born in a cabin, not unlike the one Della had built, educated by the mountain, in the way that people are educated when the mountain is the most consistent teacher available. She was small and deliberate in her movements, with hands that were larger than her size predicted, hands that had been doing the work of mountain living for 7 decades, and showed it in every line and callus. She had heard about Calder Falls from Gideon Pratt, who had been telling the story to everyone who came into his store since the December storms, plainly, and without embellishment, the way he reported any fact he considered significant. People had listened with the particular attention that stories earn when they contradict something you believed you knew with certainty. Edna Sutter had listened, and then she had come to see for herself, which was how she approached most claims about the world. She arrived without announcement on a clear March morning and walked up the approach path at the pace of someone who had been walking difficult terrain for 7 decades and had not found it necessary to develop opinions about the difficulty. She stood at the chamber entrance and looked at it with the eyes of someone who was not going to be moved by appearances, only by what things actually were when you paid attention to them properly. She went in. She walked the full length of the primary chamber and the secondary passage. She crouched beside the growing beds and took soil between her fingers and rubbed it and smelled it. She looked at the spring and the basin and the drainage channel. She examined Nessa's temperature maps without asking what they were, because she understood from the logic of the markings what they were recording. Then she sat down near the spring and looked at Della. She said, "The soil in the primary beds is beginning to deplete. You can see it in the older lettuce. The leaves are reaching for something the soil isn't providing anymore. Della had noticed it. She had not yet identified what it signified. Nitrogen, Edna said. The plants extract it, and you remove the plants, and you don't return what was taken. Eventually, the soil becomes a surface that supports weight rather than a system that supports growth. She paused. Your animals produce nitrogen every day in their waste. You've been removing that waste. You should be composting it, broken down, not raw, and returning most of it to the beds. The mountain gives you everything you need to maintain this indefinitely. You just have to close the cycle. Eat. She said this as information, not criticism, not instruction, in the tone of someone who expects the information to be resisted. Just here is what is true, delivered to someone who can use it. Over the following weeks, Edna came 3 more times. Each visit brought something, a method, an observation, a technique, refined through more years of practice than Della had been alive. She taught the lacto-fermentation process she had been using for 50 years, pressing vegetables into crocks with salt and wild apple cider vinegar and sealing them with rendered tallow. She showed Della how to read a stored root vegetable from its exterior to determine whether the interior had begun to fail before that failure became visible. She explained the planting cycles she had observed through decades of mountain seasons, not from any written source, but from the accumulated record of what had worked and what hadn't, season after season, until the pattern was reliable enough to act on. Della listened the way she listened to everything completely, without interrupting with the part of her mind that stored useful information already organized and receiving. She asked questions only for genuine clarification. Edna answered with the directness of someone who respected a question that was actually a question rather than a position in disguise. On her 4th visit, Edna brought her granddaughter, a girl of 15, who wanted to learn fermentation, and ended up staying 2 weeks working in the outdoor garden beds each morning and spending her afternoons with Nessa, learning the temperature mapping system. Della did not charge for any of it. These were not transactions in money. They were transactions in knowledge, and knowledge traded that way accumulated differently than money. It grew in both directions simultaneously, enriching both parties without diminishing either. Harriet Voss returned in April with Wren, both of them recovered and fully themselves again. Harriet had a proposal she had been working on since the storms of December. She wanted to bring her older students to Calder Falls as a practical lesson, not as recreation, not as an excursion, as education. How do you build a system of living from the actual resources of a specific place? How do you read terrain before you act on it? How do you calculate what you need against what you have? And what you do when the answer to that calculation is uncomfortable. She said, I don't want the children to learn how to live in a cave. I want them to learn how to look at a place and see its possibilities before deciding it has none. Della and Nessa agreed. 3 weeks later, 10 children arrived on a clear October morning with wide eyes and the noise level appropriate to their age and the guidance of Wren, who had been in this place in its most extreme condition and carried that knowledge with the quiet authority it conferred. Della showed them the passage through the water curtain one at a time, with the instruction not to speak for the first full minute inside the chamber, only to listen. Then she explained the system with the same economy she used with adults. The temperature zones, the spring, the growing beds and their position relative to the light, the separation of animal and food storage spaces. The children asked questions that were sometimes sharper than the questions adults asked because they had not yet developed the habit of assuming they already knew the answer. One child, dark-haired, serious-faced 8 or 9, stood in front of the growing beds for longer than the others and then asked, How do the plants know it's daytime if it always looks the same in here? Della looked at him. It was exactly the right question, the question that went to the actual operating principle of the system rather than its appearance. She said, The plants don't know it's daytime in the way you know it's daytime. They respond to light and moisture and soil temperature. The work here is to provide enough of those things in the right amounts that the plant can continue growing, even when the conditions outside are hostile. You're not tricking the plant. You're meeting its actual requirements by means it doesn't need to understand. The child thought about this for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, the nod of someone fitting a new piece into a frame that has been waiting for it. Harriet Voss, standing at the back of the chamber, wrote something in her notebook. Clem Pratt arrived in April with a canvas pack and the expression of someone who had heard considerable description of a place and was now engaged in the task of reconciling the description with the reality. He was 18, lean, observant, with the long, careful fingers of someone who had spent years doing precise work with small objects. He spent his first day carrying soil from the creek bank to the chamber, a task Della gave him without explanation. He carried it without asking why, which told her something useful about him. At the end of the day, when the work was done, he asked why. Not as resistance, as genuine inquiry. She explained the nitrogen cycle, the depletion. Edna had identified the need to return what the plants extracted. He listened, was quiet for a moment, then asked how many loads per week were needed to maintain the balance given the current bed size and plant turnover. She told him she didn't have a precise number yet. He took out a notebook he had brought unprompted and began working through the calculation from the information she had provided. He arrived at a number that she had not computed, but that when she considered it against what she knew from observation seemed consistent with what the system was telling her. That was the day Clem Pratt became someone the work could use. Through the spring and into the summer of 1884, he moved through the system with the analytical attention of someone who thinks in quantities and relationships and finds the translation of experience into number to be a natural and satisfying operation. He converted Della's accumulated knowledge held in her body in the muscle memory of months of physical work, in the instincts that observation builds without announcing itself into written records organized by category and date, precise enough that someone who had never been to Calder Falls could read them and understand the structure of what existed there. He asked questions in the evenings after the day's work was done, and the questions were usually the right ones. Burton Hale came in May, brought by Gideon Pratt on a day when the falls were running their spring volume and the light through the water curtain was at the best angle of the year, the angle that turned the chamber into something that looked designed by someone who understood both architecture and light, which it had not been, and which made it no less remarkable. Burton Hale was 62, a civil engineer retired from 30 years of building water management infrastructure across the American South Canals, culverts, drainage systems, the practical hydraulic plumbing that agricultural civilization depends on without thinking about until it fails. He had the habit of silence that develops in people who have learned that looking longer than is socially comfortable before speaking produces better results than the alternative. He walked the chamber for the full morning. He crouched at the drainage channel Della had cut and ran his finger along its angle. He looked at the way the spring moved through its basin and away. He examined the mineral deposits at the junction of the wall and the floor, reading in them the record of centuries of water behavior. At midday, he sat down on the flat rock near the spring and said, "The passive drainage system you built by using the natural angle of the basalt to redirect surface moisture away from the growing areas, that technique is documented in Roman engineering texts on underground construction. Not a variation of it, the same principle arrived at by the same method." He said it as a technical observation. Della said, "I found it by watching where the water went on its own and deciding not to fight it." He looked at her. "That is precisely how the Romans found it. 2,000 years ago and an ocean away, and you arrived at the same solution by the same process." He left the following morning, and he left behind a copy of a hydraulic engineering text with 7 pages marked. That night, Della read it by lamplight until the oil ran low, and she found in the diagrams and the formal technical language the mathematical description of things her hands had already understood, the vocabulary for principles she had discovered through error and observation, and the patient willingness to let the problem teach her what it knew. She read it again the following night, and the night after. In September, a letter arrived from the Bureau of Colonial Settlement, a federal office administering land allocation and development programs across the rural territories of the expanding frontier. The letter had been forwarded through Gideon Pratt's store to the proprietor of the Calder Falls land settlement in Claiborne County, Tennessee. Burton Hale had written to them. He had described what he had seen at Calder Falls with the precise, unsentimental language of an engineer's report: the passive temperature management, the underground cultivation system, the spring water utilization, the structural integration of natural formations with constructed elements. He had noted that the system had demonstrated winter survivability through one of the most severe seasons in recent county history, including sheltering and sustaining multiple people during conditions that had proven dangerous in the open. He had suggested that the methods developed there were applicable to settlement communities across the Northern Territories, where winter food preservation was a critical annual problem for dozens of isolated communities without access to commercial supply. The Bureau asked if Della and her collaborators would be willing to present their methods at a regional conference in Asheville, North Carolina. Travel expenses would be covered. Della read the letter twice and handed it to Nessa. Nessa read it once and set it down and looked at the falls for a moment. Then she said, "Would you go?" Della considered it the way she considered anything that required a decision, by walking it through her mind, the way she walked difficult terrain, testing the ground before committing weight to it. She had not left Calder Falls since the day she had arrived. The work was here. The work required her presence. The work was in the most complete sense she had available enough. But "I don't know what they know in Asheville that we don't know here," she said. "But I also don't know what they know that we don't know. The only way to find out is to go." Nessa said, "Then we go together." They went in October, when the system was stable enough to be left in Clem's hands for the 10 days the journey required. Clem received this responsibility with the seriousness of someone who understood what was being trusted to him and did not require that understanding to be stated. He simply began asking the questions he would need answered before they left. Asheville occupied a river valley in the North Carolina mountains with the settled, substantial permanence of a place that had been conducting commerce long enough to have developed considered opinions about how commerce should be conducted. The conference was held in the community hall behind the main church, a long room with plank floors and rows of benches filled when Della and Nessa arrived with men and women from across the ridge country, all carrying the particular bearing of people who work outdoor land and have learned to take up the minimum necessary space when indoors. Della sat and listened for most of the first day. She had attended nothing like this before and processed it the way she processed new terrain, by moving through it carefully until its shape became clear. The presentations were practical. A man from the eastern lowlands who had refined cold storage using deep earth cellars lined with river clay. A woman from the high country who had developed a seed preservation method using the mineral-rich soil of specific creek beds. An engineer barely older than Clem working on a gravity-fed irrigation system that required no mechanical components and could be built by one person with basic tools and a reliable understanding of elevation change. Nessa talked to all of them. She asked direct questions and exchanged written addresses and spent the evenings in their rented room going through what she had learned, organizing it against what they already knew, identifying where the gaps were, and where something someone else had developed could be applied at Calder Falls. On the second afternoon, at the close of the final presentation of the day, a man approached Della. He was dressed for a city rather than a working conference, the clothes of commerce in a room full of production. Perhaps 45, with the careful manner of someone whose professional life required the management of other people's decisions. He introduced himself as a representative of Greer & Sons, a mineral extraction and land development company based in Knoxville. He said he recognized her name from the Calder Falls land records. He said his company had assessed that land 18 months prior and determined it unsuitable for their purposes. He said that assessment had been based on the assumption that the land was and would remain undeveloped. He understood that assumption was no longer accurate. He said Greer & Sons would be interested in revisiting a purchase offer at a price that reflected the land's current developed value. Della listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "No, not qualified, not conditional. One word in the register of something that has been decided and does not require discussion." The man named a figure. It was a genuine figure, not an insult, not an opening position designed to be negotiated upward. A real number representing a real offer from a company with the means to make it good. Della looked at him for a moment in the way she looked at things that were finished. Then she turned and walked to where Nessa was still in conversation with the irrigation engineer. She stood for a moment before she spoke because something had shifted in her chest, and she wanted to understand it clearly before she added words to it. The man from Greer & Sons had told her something without intending to. His company had passed on the land when it was only rock and water. They were willing to pay real money for it now because someone had looked at the same rock and water and found what was in them, and the finding had been the thing of value all along. The value Greer & Sons wanted to purchase had never been in the land. It had been in the particular way she looked at things that other people had already looked at and decided were finished with. Her father had sent her to a place he considered worthless, expecting her to fail in it, having arranged to benefit from that failure. He had been right about one thing. The land by itself had been worth almost nothing. He had been wrong about the only thing that mattered. She joined Nessa's conversation and stayed in it for an hour, learning what there was to learn about moving water across complex terrain using nothing but its own weight and the reliable pull of gravity. They left Asheville on a clear October morning and made the journey back to Claiborne County in 3 days of steady walking through mountains, burning with autumn color the particular extravagance of Appalachian fall, the red and gold against the granite and the deep green of the hemlocks that refused the season's palette entirely. They talked when they had something to say. They were quiet when they did not. This was the most comfortable form of travel either of them had found. They came around the last bend in the approach path in the late afternoon of the third day, and Calder Falls appeared before them, white and enormous and entirely certain of itself. And Della felt something she recognized but still did not have a precise word for. The feeling of returning to a place that is yours in the way that very few places are actually yours, not by document alone, not by inheritance, but by the investment of your own hands and attention over enough time that the place has learned your rhythms as thoroughly as you have learned its. Clem met them at the cabin door with the 10-day log temperatures egg production plant growth measurements. The one drainage incident in the secondary chamber that had required clearing after heavy rain. He handed it to Nessa without ceremony and turned to Della with a question about expanding the outdoor garden beds before the first hard frost. They went in. That evening, Orville Ware came. Della was near the chamber entrance, sorting seed stock from the season's harvest for the following spring when she heard footsteps on the approach path. Not cautious steps, not the steps of someone uncertain about their welcome. The steps of a man who had made a decision and was in the process of carrying it out. She went to the cabin door and opened it. Orville Ware was 52 years old, and the years had made him more himself rather than different. The particular difficult self, he had always been more concentrated, now less diluted, by whatever had once balanced it out. He was not a man time had softened. He was a man time had refined. He stood on the flat ground in front of the cabin and looked at what was there. The cabin. The chimney with its thin thread of evening smoke. The timber and stone overhang along the eastern face. The organized woodpile. The outdoor garden beds covered for winter under dry grass. He looked at all of it for a long time without speaking. Della waited. She had been waiting for Orville Ware's words her entire life. She was practiced at it. He reached into his coat and brought out a book. Not a letter. A book, small, leather-covered, worn at the spine and corners in the way of something that has been handled frequently and with the hands of someone who was not being careful, or who was being careful about the content rather than the object. He held it out toward her with one hand, the same gesture with which he had held out the land deed 14 months before. She took it. She looked at it and understood immediately what she was holding. A notebook. Cora's notebook. But not the one she had found in the chamber. This one was thicker. More pages, the cover darker and more worn, older. A different book entirely. She opened it. Cora's handwriting, but earlier the letters slightly less controlled than the chamber notebooks, the margins less consistent, the hand of someone who had not yet settled into the precise economical style that the chamber copy displayed. She read the first pages in the doorway with the evening light falling on the paper and understood what she was holding. This was the original. The notebook she had found in the chamber had been a fair copy. Cora had transcribed her measurements and plans into the smaller book before hiding it, making a clean technical record to leave behind. This one, the source, had remained in Cora's house, in Orville's house after Cora died, where it had sat since. The final pages of this book were intact, the pages that had been removed from the chamber copy, the pages whose absence Della had noticed from the ragged stubs at the binding and had never been able to account for. They were here, in their original form, written in the hand of a woman who had had something to say that she was not yet finished deciding how to handle. Della read them. The final entries were dated the autumn before Cora's death. They were different in tone from the technical records that preceded them, less measured in their language, more direct, written in the way that people write when they have been building towards saying something for a long time, and have finally decided that the building is finished. Cora had known about Greer and Sons. She had known about Orville's approach to them, his proposal to sell the land she had not yet decided to sell. She had known about the survey conducted without her knowledge in August. She had written all of this down with the same factual precision she used for temperature readings as information without the distortion of emotion recorded, because recording was how she processed things she needed to understand fully before acting on. She had decided not to confront Orville directly because, in her experience, confronting Orville directly about a decision he had made had never changed the decision. She had written this too without bitterness as an observed fact about a person she had known her entire life. What she had decided to do instead was simpler and more permanent. She would leave the land to the person most likely to see what she had seen in it, and to have the particular kind of will that seeing required. She had been watching her brother's daughters growing up, watching from the careful distance of someone who understood that direct observation changed what was being observed, and she had formed a view. She wrote the view at the bottom of the final page. 2 sentences. Della read them 3 times. Then she looked up from the book. Orville was still standing in the same position, looking at the cabin rather than at her, looking at the things she had built. He said, "I found the book when I was going through her things after she passed. I read it." He paused. "I read it more than once over the months." Della said nothing. "She was right about you," he said. The words came out with the flatness of Orville's words, always not adjusted for the person receiving them, not softened or padded, just delivered. She was right, and I was wrong, and those two things are both true at the same time and don't cancel each other. He was not a man who had the words for the larger version of what he was trying to say. He had spent his life in the company of the smaller practical version of language, the words of farm and season and transaction, and the larger version was not practiced enough to come easily. She could see the effort of it in the set of his jaw. He did not apologize. He was not a man who said that word, and she did not need him to be. She had built something that did not require his apology to remain standing. What it was built on was older and more solid than his opinion of it had ever been, and his opinion, changing or not changing, would not alter the stone. He turned to go, then stopped. "The other girl," he said. "Nessa. She's here." "Yes." He nodded once. That was all. He walked back down the path at the pace of a man who has a long walk ahead of him and has already made his peace with the distance. Della stood at the cabin door and watched him until the path took him around the first bend and the trees closed behind him. She stood there a little longer. The falls ran their evening sound, steady and ongoing and entirely their own. The first stars were appearing in the strip of sky between the ridgelines. Somewhere in the chamber behind her, the goat made a sound and was quiet again. She looked down at the book in her hands. The two sentences at the bottom of Cora's final page were, "These Della sees things. Give her something to see." She stood with those words in the October evening for a long time, long enough that the cold began to make itself known, and the stars multiplied overhead, and the falls continued their conversation with the rocks below with the complete indifference of water that has been saying the same thing for longer than anything listening to it has been alive. Then she went inside. Nessa was at the table with her notebooks and Clem's 10-day log and the notes from Asheville spread out in front of her, organizing information that needed to be organized. She looked up when Della came in, looked at the book in Della's hands and waited. Della set the book on the table and sat down across from her. She said, "Cora knew." Nessa looked at the book, then at Della. She did not press for more than that because she understood that more would come when it was ready to come. She knew about Pa and the land company. She knew before she died. She left the land the way she left it because she decided it was more useful as a foundation than as a confrontation. Della paused. She watched us. She decided I was the one to leave it to. Nessa was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why you and not me?" Della thought about that. "I don't think it was one instead of the other," she said. "I think she knew that if I came, you would come. That's a different kind of calculation than choosing between two people." Nessa looked at the book. "Can I read it?" "Yes." Nessa drew it toward her and opened it carefully with the hands of someone who understood that old things require that particular care. They sat in silence for a while, the lamp between them, the fire in the stove, the night coming down fully outside with the cold it always brought from the ridgeline. The falls ran as they always ran. The chamber breathed its slow stone breath behind them, maintaining its temperature with the perfect autonomy of rock that has been doing this for longer than human plans extend in any direction. Later that night, after Clem had gone to his corner of the sleeping loft, and Nessa had set down the notebook and let her eyes close, Della sat up a little longer by the fire that had burned down to its coals. She thought about Cora, who had found this place and understood it and left it, who had spent years after that carrying the knowledge of it, the way you carry something you have decided belongs to someone else, but have not yet found the right way to deliver, who had looked at her brother's daughters from a careful distance and chosen, and then arranged what she could arrange, and then let go of the outcome. She thought about the two sentences. She thought about Silas Greer naming a number in a room full of working people, and what the willingness to name that number revealed about where the value had always resided. She thought about Gideon Pratt tearing a document in two on a flat stone in the silence behind a waterfall, and what that transaction had been. Not generosity, not charity, but the recognition that one capable person extends to another when they have identified the capability for what it actually is. She thought about the lambs born in January in the warmth of the chamber who had never known the mountain as a hostile place, because they had come into the world in a space where the mountain had been made into something else entirely. The fire held its coals, which gave off the steady warmth of things that have finished their burning and are now giving back what the burning made.
The work would continue.
The second round of consultation with Clem about the winter seed storage Nessa had proposed. The draft of the letter to the Bureau. Yes, she would participate in the settlement guidance program on the terms she had specified, with the conditions that protected the work and the place. The ongoing record. The ongoing attention.
The ongoing practice of looking at a place until it revealed what it had always been willing to reveal to anyone patient enough to remain in front of it.
She rose from the chair. She banked the coals carefully, the way she did every night, larger pieces at the center, where they would hold heat the longest, giving her something to work with in the morning. She climbed to the sleeping loft. Through the small window she had cut in the north wall, she could see a strip of sky dark and clear. The stars in their patient abundance over the ridge, indifferent to season and to everything that moved beneath them, with the confidence of things that do not move.
Nessa was breathing slowly in the lower bunk.
From the chamber below the cabin, the spring moved in its stone channel, patient and clean and continuous. The animals breathed. The growing beds held their soil and their roots and their readiness for whatever the morning light through the water curtain would offer them.
The falls ran outside as they had run for longer than anything in the valley, had a name for spending themselves completely every second, and never running out, giving everything they had to the world below without keeping any of it, without rest, without the need for any recognition of what they were doing or why.
Della lay down in the dark and let the sound of falling water carry her toward sleep, the way it had carried her every night for 14 months, the way it would carry her for every night she could see from here and many nights beyond that. She had come to a place the world had decided was worth nothing. She had looked at it the way her aunt had taught her to look, without ever saying a word to her about looking with her full attention, without arriving at the place already knowing what she would find. She had found water and stone and silence and the particular quality of darkness that knows how to grow things. She had built on all of it. In the morning she would take the axe down from its hook, test the weight of it in her palm, the way she tested the weight of everything, honestly, without pretending it was lighter than it was, and she would go out and do the next thing that needed doing.
The falls would still be there.
They would be there tomorrow and in the winter to come, and in every spring after it, moving through the same arc of season that everything in the valley moved through, indifferent and immense and perpetually themselves. It was enough to do the work. It had always been enough.